Creation's Journey to Life, Day 54, The Original Human. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to not realize that nothing original has ever been discovered or invented by the human. Everything ever found was always already here. All the human can do is establish relationships and observe relationships and direct relationships. Those relationships determine the nature of the human and binds the human to consequence. I forgive myself that I haven't accepted and allowed myself to realize that even in the quantum reality, relationships define each other in a mirror. Just like the human is defined by relationships and what relationships the human participates in. No one is ever alone. Each is only ever part, and the part each play determines reality for all partners in the play with the resultant consequences. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to not realize that all existing relationships can be broken down to direct connection of one, which is the determining oneness as what the relationship is equal to, and that one by one, the relationships accumulates to form movement and direction within relationships that determines what is termed creation. Creation, thus, is not the original beginning, as all beginnings have an end or outcome or consequence. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to not realize that to create is not divine, but is only the growth of a vine of one by one connections that eventually carries an outcome, or a fruit determined by the nature of the connection formed one by one, which becomes the resultant temporary consciousness as the equal to answer to the formed relationships. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to not realize that the desired return to source or origin or nothingness that existed before creation of relationships is in fact the resultant outcome of all relationships formed in ways that are unequal to the source in its nature at formation. And to claim one is returning to source as if you are source when your formed relationships prove you are not is self-deception, as the self that deceived itself is the result of relationship accumulation and not the equality as source, as life. And therefore, all creation unequal to source is always a temporary illusion that returns to source, wiped out forever as what it was. What was, just an illusion in every way. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to not realize that the source before creation is life, and that all relationships formed from source that are not equal and one in the nature at source as life will by their very nature not be life. This determines that all that is here in its substance as source is life, unless it is not. And the not is determined by the nature of the relationships formed between each part individually, and not determined by the resultant consciousness when looking in the mirror at its formed relationships. This conclusively determines the outcome of all relationships formed that does not conclusively result in an outcome that reflects an image and likeness of itself, that actual equality in connections at source as life, as equal and one. And therefore, all outcomes are in fact always known within the bonds at relationship formed as what it is equal to, and only that which is in all ways source as life, as equal as bond, is in fact eternal as life. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to not realize that spirit is not origin or source, as spirit is formed from relationships as creation, and is thus always equal to the nature of the relationships formed and less than source, unless the bond is life, as the equal to source, which will reflect in the resultant equality as life as source. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to not realize that the human was not created, but created itself through the relationships it formed and allowed to be formed, and that the very spirit of these relationships determines the nature of human spirituality. I forgive myself that I have accepted and allowed myself to not realize that the key to life is in the equality of relationships, where one is equal to what you give, as that is what you will receive. And thus the choice to be life is always available until it's not, and that the total creation of the human is a lie that will end, as it is not equal to source as life eternal. I commit myself to show that all science and mathematics as accepted by the human are only looking at the limited relationships formed through human interaction and bonds, and that these are the chains that bind the human to its own inevitable destruction, as the human created itself not in the image and likeness of life as source, but in the separation and greed of self-interest in separation to life, justified through energy and consciousness, through which the human attempted to make its spirit superior to life. I commit myself to show that the world of the human, as it exists in all its relationships, is reflected in the mirror of human civilization, where, throughout time, attempts have been made to make the life of human creation look civil, when in fact it is formed in complete separation from source as life, and through this choice condemned to nothing. I commit myself to show that the equality equation of 1 + 1 = 2 is the blueprint that measures the outcome of all relationships and is the determining factor of all creation, determining what is life and what is not life, that is able to be understood by every human and every child that gains consciousness to see directly whether human creation is life or not, and that therefore there is not and will not be any excuse that can ever justify the separation from life and the resultant abuse, as the spirit that is allowed to be created. Let it be clear, that which is not life cannot hear the destiny message, yet the equality equation allows you to see and eventually hear, and that anyone can only disregard the destiny message with grave consequence, as the graven image, that is not equal and one as life, will end in the grave. The destiny portal is the final opportunity for existence as the illusion to return to life. I commit myself to show that all creation as it exists now is the result of unequal relationships in separation to source as life, and as such is an opportunity to realize the separation and inequality, to thus change, to return and amalgamate with life as equal as one, and to then form only relationships that are always equal and one as life, so that life may be born from the physical as self, being as it must be the very creation of self as life, as one can only be life if you can create yourself as life, according to relationships that in their very nature support life as equal as one as life. No separation ever exists, as it is source, as it is life. I commit myself to show that the return to nothingness, while in the flesh, is the return to source, which, after the opportunity to rebirth oneself as life, and then as evidence of the reformation, one will be measured as to the relationships formed, whether it is equal and one as life or not. There is no middle road, and the grave is too late. Postponement is not suggested, as no one holds the arms of time. I commit myself to show that the consciousness is the spirit of self-deception, formed by the greed to be life, without understanding and realizing that the relationship formed the consciousness as consequence of the separation from life, and therefore consciousness in its very nature is nothing but self-created illusion. I commit myself to show that spirituality is the duality of the spirit with which relationships are formed in the nature of the polarity of good and evil, and win and lose, when life exists as no polarity, and polarity only exists where relationships are not equal and one as life in all ways. I commit myself to show that choice is never free unless it is life, as equal as one as source, reflected in the relationships, equality, and that any choice made in separation is not free, as it is bound to consequence equal and one. I commit myself to show that life does not judge. Each one judge themselves through what each one creates and the relationships that are formed, and therefore the relationships that are formed that are not equal and one as life in every way. The creator of the relationships creates itself as less that life and thus illusion, and is thus judged as the creation is created and all illusions was, is, and will be always just illusion. I commit myself to show that self-realization does not magically make one life. It must be living movement of life as source, as substance, reflected in the evidence of all relationships, giving life as life, regardless of perceived definition of knowledge. Knowledge is in fact always useless illusions.